Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Adam.
So today we're taking a few minutes to look at market trends and drafting considerations within turnover leases and turnover concessions. Leanne and I are both associate directors in the real estate team at Osborne Clark, and we've seen a seismic shift towards turnover rents, especially in the retail, F&B and leisure sphere in probably the last 6 to 12 months. Of course, this has been accelerated by COVID and the toll the pandemic has taken on the industry, but this was becoming a much more common trend, and I'm sure it is set to be enshrined in certain retail leases for the foreseeable future. So taking a look at the market trends we're seeing first.
Yeah, so as Adam's noted, over the last year, we've seen an increase in turnover rents and new leases. And in reality, we had been seeing such provisions occurring more frequently over the last 18 months or so, as tenants push for greater risk sharing in challenging trading circumstances. We're now seeing an increase in turnover-only rents for shorter-term leases, particularly in the retail market, and a greater prevalence of turnover top-up rents in other areas. And I think it's likely that we'll see this trend continue, but with greater flexibility around termination to balance the risk that landlords are taking. And a necessary consequence of an increase in turnover rent is an increase in data collection. So tenants are required to evidence their turnover, and landlords need to be able to review that information. And increasingly, landlords are relying on their own data collection systems to supplement the information provided to them by tenants to enable them to build a real-time picture of trading performance. But this raises challenges for landlords under the revised GDPR provisions, and so landlords do need to ensure they have robust procedures in place when collecting turnover data.
Yeah, thanks for that. And just to pick up a couple more, as a result of the COVID pandemic, there are, as you would expect, a number of concessions granting temporary rent waivers, or sometimes leaving turnover rent only in place. The key caveat here is to make sure that where the tenant is not able to trade, but can and does generate income from the store, perhaps by fulfilling online orders, the turnover rent should remain chargeable, and that turnover rent should be pegged against that temporary zero base rent rather than the pre-concession base rent. We're also seeing some landlords looking for something in return for these pandemic rent concessions. Something I have seen is landlords seeking the ability for a landlord break in the lease where the tenant is underperforming. This allows the landlord a better opportunity to create the retail scheme, and also if it's pegged against turnover rents, then if there's limited turnover, then there's limited rent to the landlord. So this is quite necessary. If the tenants perform better, then the turnover rents will improve, and the wider offering is more attractive to customers and therefore to other retailers. So it's a circular cycle of improvement. So next, I want us to run through some important drafting considerations. As turnover rents are becoming more common and more bespoke, I am seeing some, shall we say, interesting agreements and wording in the heads of terms that they come through to us. So please get your lawyers involved at the head stage when considering any non-vanilla turnover provisions. Bespoke turnover provisions, whilst often necessary, they do impact on many areas of the lease. Not least in relation to rent review potentially and the disparity of the rental years and the turnover rent years. So if we can get involved in the structuring of the heads at that stage, it helps prevent having to renegotiate the terms once they come through to the lawyers. And it will end up keeping your legal costs down, the all-important one. Okay, so Leanne, please can you run us through some areas that we seek to pick up in the drafting?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Adam. So as I mentioned before, a necessary consequence of turnover rent provisions is data collection. So we frequently see drafting which entitles landlords to install their own data collection software at tenants' point of sale so that they can collect real-time trading data. And that's particularly useful for landlords who operate multi-tenanted facilities so that they can track the overall performance of their estate. But as noted previously, this brings with it data protection issues. So landlords really do need to be mindful of that and ensure that they've got compliant procedures in place to deal with how they process, use and store that information. And what we're also seeing, and what you also need to be mindful of in the drafting, is capturing more areas of turnover. So historically, in the loosest sense of that word, turnover focused on sales fulfilled in store. But with online trading, click and collect, delivery services, and other complexities around vouchers, promotions, refunds, similar things such as that, landlords have to think more forensically about what gross turnover actually means in the modern world. So common turnover provisions now capture orders that are accepted, received, processed at, or collected from the property, and also extend to orders that are wholly or partly fulfilled from another location, charges made by the tenant for delivery, and items purchased using credit instalments or hire purchase options.
Yeah, so just picking up on some of those points, we are looking for opportunities in our drafting, if appropriate, as to how we can include turnover from outside the unit. So as Leanne mentioned, this may be where an order is made online but fulfilled on site, or it could be where an item is bought in store, maybe on an iPad, but delivered from another warehouse. We can include a prohibition on something like dark kitchens when we're looking at F&B, or fulfillment from another location within a catchment area, unless an element of that localized group turnover is already included in the rent. And then just thinking about the future, we're working with our data protection colleagues as to predictions and drafting that could enable the use of customer data that's captured within a shopping scheme to be used to establish whether a particular shopper bought from a tenant's website, having previously visited that tenant store within our landlord's scheme. So a turnover rent provision could then capture an element or the entirety of the turnover generated by that sale. The key here, of course, would be obtaining the shopper's express consent to their data being stored and used and followed in relation to those stores within the shopping scheme visited. I definitely don't think we're quite ready for this, but with the value of data being explored more and more, this is bound to become a reality in the next number of years. Especially as more stores act as marketing and branding tools rather than holding high levels of stock that they sell on site. So anyway, I think that's for another time, and I may have digressed from turnover rents, but I think it's important to see what there is in store for us in the future.
Yeah, definitely. And I think these points raise a question that we're seeing being asked in the industry, which is, are commercial leases actually fit for purpose, particularly in the context of turnover rent provisions? And increasingly, we're seeing that the standards of traditional turnover provisions just aren't. Tenants are struggling in increasingly challenging markets, so we're seeing more and more inventive agreements, such as hybrid seasonal base rent and turnover rent provisions, or more simply the concept of monthly turnover rents payable in arrears. But with such agreements come challenges. So taking that sort of monthly turnover rent example, that creates a reporting burden. It creates an analysis burden for the landlord and can result in a big degree of fluctuation between peak trading and low trading points. So how does that work for investors and valuers? And similarly, in the context of repurposing real estate, given the recent use class changes, will turnover rents be appropriate, where assets that were traditionally dominated by retail tenants move to a mix between retail, office, leisure and services? Or will we actually start to see turnover rent for more traditional service providers and professional services, as well as just retail tenants?
Yeah, I think that's a really useful consideration there. So I want to thank you, Leanne, for joining me today to discuss turnover rents. We're seeing this is a key trend within repurposing the retail lease, and there will definitely be more developments in both the commercial drivers behind agreeing turnover rents and the scope, and also the legal drafting. And remember, the most important point is please do get lawyers involved before you finalise the heads. Thanks for listening, and look out for the next in our series on repurposing retail.